Margaret Chen froze mid-stride across her ranch yard, the feed bucket slipping from her weathered hands as thunder's earth-shaking bellow pierced the Nevada morning silence. The massive black Brahman bull stood rigid against the eastern fence, his 1,200-pound frame trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. This wasn't his usual gentle lowing. This was pure, primal terror. 40 miles away in the Mojave Desert, 4 children lay dying in an abandoned pickup truck while the richest man in Nevada drove away without looking back. Thunder's enormous head swung toward her, his dark eyes wide with an intelligence that made her blood run cold. The feed scattered across the dirt as Margaret stumbled backward, watching her gentle giant transform into something she'd never seen before. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Thunder's desperate calls echoing across the empty desert. "What did you see, boy?" Somewhere in that vast wasteland, innocent lives hung in the balance. And somehow, Thunder knew. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor Thompson sat in her rusted Toyota Corolla outside the towering iron gates of the Ashford estate, her arthritic fingers gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. At 73, she'd buried her husband at 22 and her son at 45, but nothing had prepared her for watching 4 grandchildren slowly fade away from diseases their family couldn't afford to treat. The mansion beyond those gates rose like a monument to wealth she'd never imagined, 47 rooms of marble and crystal worth more than her entire neighborhood combined. William Ashford, Nevada's real estate king, lived there alone since his son's death 8 years ago. Eleanor clutched the manila envelope containing medical bills totaling $47,000, a sum that might as well have been $47 million on her Social Security income of $1,200 a month. Inside that envelope were photographs of Emma, 8 years old with cystic fibrosis, her oxygen tank never far from reach. Lucas, 7, whose severe asthma attacks came without warning, sometimes 3 times a night. Sophie, 6, still fighting pneumonia complications from last winter. And little Noah, barely 5, whose immune system was so fragile that a common cold could kill him. Eleanor had raised these babies since their parents died in that horrible accident at Robert's construction site, William Ashford's construction site. Her son had worked 15 faithful years for Ashford Construction, never missing a day, never complaining about the long hours or dangerous conditions. When that crane collapsed, taking Robert and his wife Sarah, William Ashford had sent flowers to the funeral and a sympathy card with his corporate logo. Now Eleanor lived in a condemned trailer on the outskirts of Henderson, Nevada, where the electricity had been shut off last month and the water would be next. She'd sold everything of value, her wedding ring, Robert's tools, even Sarah's grandmother's china. The children slept on mattresses on the floor, sharing threadbare blankets, while Eleanor lay awake calculating which medications they could skip to buy groceries. The security guard finally approached her car, his expression softening when he saw her worn hands and the tears she couldn't hide. "Ma'am, this is private property. You'll need an appointment to—" "Please," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cracking. "I just need 5 minutes with Mr. Ashford. My grandchildren are dying and I don't have anywhere else to turn." Something in her desperate dignity made the guard pause. He'd been working these gates for 12 years, turning away countless people seeking William Ashford's legendary generosity. But this elderly woman, with her carefully mended dress and stubborn hope, reminded him of his own grandmother. "Wait here," he said quietly, walking back to his booth to make the call that would change everything. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and whispered the same prayer she'd been praying every night. "Lord, if you're listening, these babies need a miracle. They're all I got left of my boy." She had no way of knowing that 40 miles away, Thunder had just lifted his massive head toward the eastern horizon, sensing something terrible approaching on the desert wind. The marble foyer of the Ashford mansion stretched before Eleanor like a cathedral, its vaulted ceilings echoing her hesitant footsteps. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across polished floors that reflected her worn shoes and carefully mended coat. She clutched her purse tighter, feeling desperately out of place in this palace of wealth. William Ashford emerged from his study with the measured stride of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. At 58, he carried himself with the confidence that $8 billion could buy. Perfectly tailored suit, silver hair that seemed immune to Nevada's desert wind, and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they saw. His public face was all charitable smiles and philanthropic warmth, the same expression that graced the covers of Forbes and Philanthropy Today. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it?" His voice carried the practiced concern of someone who'd perfected the art of appearing compassionate. "My security chief mentioned you have grandchildren in need of medical care." Eleanor's prepared speech crumbled in her throat. Standing before this monument to success, she felt the weight of every unpaid bill, every sleepless night, every prayer whispered over fevered foreheads. "Mr. Ashford, sir, I know you don't know me from Adam, but my boy Robert worked for your company for 15 years before the accident." William's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a brief tightening that Eleanor was too nervous to notice. Robert Thompson, the crane operator who died when safety protocols were ignored to meet a deadline. The lawsuit that had cost Ashford Construction $2 million in settlements. The reminder of shortcuts taken and lives lost in the pursuit of profit. "Of course," William said smoothly. "Robert was a valued employee. His loss was tragic." Eleanor opened her manila envelope with trembling fingers, spreading medical records across his mahogany desk like a desperate hand of cards. "These are his children, Mr. Ashford, my grandbabies. Emma's got cystic fibrosis. She needs treatments 3 times a day or her lungs'll give out. Lucas has asthma so bad he can't run like other boys his age. Sophie's been fighting pneumonia for months. And little Noah," her voice broke completely, "Noah's got no immune system left. The doctors say without proper medication, he won't see Christmas." William studied the photographs with the same detached interest he might show a property appraisal. 4 young faces smiled back at him. Emma's brave grin despite the oxygen cannula in her nose, Lucas clutching his inhaler like a security blanket, Sophie's fever-bright cheeks, Noah's too thin frame wrapped in blankets. But where Eleanor saw her precious grandchildren, William saw something else entirely. 8 years ago, his son Michael had been 8 years old when the car accident stole him away. Michael with his bright laugh and endless questions, Michael who'd loved animals and dreamed of being a veterinarian, Michael who'd been the center of William's universe until that terrible night, when a moment of distracted driving had ended everything. The resemblance was uncanny. Emma had Michael's determined chin, Lucas shared his mischievous eyes. Even their ages seemed to mock him. These children, sick and struggling, were living the years Michael would never see. The injustice of it burned in William's chest like acid. "The total medical costs?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. $47,000, Eleanor whispered. "I know it's a fortune, but I've tried everything, sold everything I own, applied for every program, begged every charity. They're good babies, Mr. Ashford. They deserve a chance." William walked to his window overlooking the manicured gardens where Michael's treehouse still stood, weathered and empty. The rational part of his mind, the businessman who'd built an empire from nothing, recognized this as an opportunity for positive publicity, a small price to pay for good press and community goodwill. But the broken father in him, the part that had never healed from Michael's loss, whispered something darker. Why should these children live when his perfect son was dead? What cosmic joke allowed flawed, diseased children to survive while healthy, brilliant Michael was taken? The thought had been growing in his mind for years, festering like an infection every time he saw happy families, healthy children, parents who still had what he'd lost. "Mrs. Thompson," he said finally, turning back to her with a smile that never reached his eyes, "I'm going to help you. In fact, I'm going to do more than help. I'm going to ensure these children receive the very best care available." Eleanor fell to her knees right there on the Persian carpet, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "God bless you, Mr. Ashford. God bless you. I knew there was good in this world. I knew it." "Please, stand up," William said, helping her to her feet with practiced gentleness. "There's just one condition. The children will need to stay here during treatment. I have a fully equipped medical suite. The process might take some time." "Whatever you think is best," Eleanor sobbed. "You're an angel sent from heaven." As William smiled and shook her grateful hand, neither of them noticed the storm clouds gathering on the eastern horizon or the way the desert wind seemed to carry whispers of warning across the Nevada wasteland. The ambulance pulled through the Ashford estate gates on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying 4 frightened children toward what Eleanor believed was salvation. Emma held Noah's small hand as the paramedics wheeled them through marble corridors that seemed to stretch forever, their medical equipment looking strangely out of place against the opulent backdrop of oil paintings and crystal fixtures. William Ashford watched from his study window as his carefully orchestrated plan began to unfold. He'd spent the past 3 days transforming a guest wing into what appeared to be a state-of-the-art medical facility, complete with monitoring equipment, IV stands, and oxygen tanks. To any observer, it looked like the generous gesture of a wealthy philanthropist. In reality, it was an elaborate stage set for something far more sinister. "Welcome to your temporary home," William announced as he entered the medical suite, his voice carrying the perfect blend of warmth and authority he'd perfected over decades of public appearances. The children huddled together on the hospital bed, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of their surroundings. Emma, ever the protective older sister, kept her arms around her younger siblings while studying William's face with the unsettling perception that only sick children seemed to possess. "Are you really going to make us better?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit William like a physical blow, reminding him painfully of Michael's last words in the hospital. "Daddy, are you going to fix me?" "I'm going to take very good care of all of you," William replied, the lie sliding smoothly off his tongue. "But first you need to rest and get stronger." Patricia Hayes, the pediatric nurse William had hired for his deception, entered carrying medical charts and wearing the kind of professional smile that was meant to comfort anxious children. At 45, Patricia had spent 20 years caring for sick kids, and something about this situation felt wrong from the moment she'd stepped foot in the mansion. The medical equipment was too new, too perfectly arranged, like a movie set rather than a functional medical facility. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, pulling him aside, "I've reviewed the children's medical histories. They need specialized care at a proper children's hospital, not a home setup, no matter how well equipped." William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've consulted with the finest specialists money can buy, Miss Hayes. They've assured me this is the best approach for these particular cases." Patricia wanted to argue further, but the $5,000 William was paying her for this week's work represented 3 months of her usual salary. Her recent divorce had left her drowning in legal fees, and her ex-husband had maxed out their credit cards before disappearing. She needed this job, even if her professional instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. Over the next 3 days, William made calculated visits to the children, each encounter carefully timed and choreographed. He brought them books he'd never read, toys he'd ordered his assistant to purchase, and spoke in the gentle tones he remembered using with Michael. But every interaction was torture. Each child's laugh or smile like salt in the wound of his loss. Wednesday evening, Noah giggled at something Lucas had whispered, and the sound stopped William cold in the doorway. It was Michael's laugh, that same uninhibited joy that had filled their house before the accident. William gripped the door frame so hard his knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to flee from the painful reminder of everything he'd lost. "Do you have any kids, Mr. Ashford?" Sophie asked innocently during one of his visits, her fever-bright eyes looking up at him with genuine curiosity. I did," William managed, his carefully constructed facade cracking. "Once." That night, William retreated to Michael's bedroom, the shrine he'd maintained exactly as his son had left it 8 years ago. Baseball trophies lined the shelves, superhero posters covered the walls, and the bed was still made with the same Star Wars sheets Michael had picked out for his 8th birthday. William sat on the small bed and spoke to the empty room as he did every night. "They're the same age you were, Michael," he whispered to the photograph on the nightstand. "Emma's 8, just like you when I lost you. It's not fair, son. It's not fair that they get to grow up when you can't." The conversation with his dead son had become a nightly ritual, but tonight it took on a darker tone. "I know what I have to do, Michael. I know how to make it right. They won't suffer like you did. It'll be quick, merciful even. The desert will take them, and no one will ever question it." Meanwhile, 40 miles away in the Nevada desert, Thunder stood at the eastern fence of Margaret's ranch, his massive frame silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The Brahman bull hadn't eaten properly in 3 days, refusing to move from his position facing toward Las Vegas. Margaret had never seen him behave this way in the 5 years since she'd rescued him from the auction yard. "What's got into you, big guy?" Margaret murmured, approaching Thunder with a bucket of his favorite grain. The bull didn't even acknowledge her presence, his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that only he could see. When she placed her hand on his flank, she could feel the tension vibrating through his massive frame like electricity. Margaret Chen had built her life around understanding animals that others had given up on. As a former veterinarian who'd lost her license after a nervous breakdown, she'd found peace in this isolated ranch, caring for creatures that society had discarded. Thunder had been one of those discards, traumatized, withdrawn, and carrying emotional scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. But tonight, Thunder's behavior sent chills down her spine. In her years of veterinary practice, she'd learned to trust animal instincts, especially when they defied explanation. Horses that refused to enter certain stalls before earthquakes, dogs that howled hours before their owners had heart attacks, cats that disappeared days before house fires. Animals possessed senses that humans had long forgotten, connections to the natural world that civilization had severed. Back at the mansion, William finalized his arrangements with Bobby Miller, the transport driver he'd carefully selected for this job. Bobby was Eleanor's estranged son, though Eleanor had no idea William knew about their connection. Bobby's heroin addiction had made him desperate enough to take any job that paid well, and William's $50,000 in cash was more money than Bobby had ever seen at one time. "The destination is exactly 40 miles into the Mojave," William explained, handing Bobby a GPS unit with the coordinates already programmed. "Tell them it's a medical facility. When you get there, you'll understand what needs to be done." Bobby's hands shook as he pocketed the money, not from drug withdrawal, but from the growing realization of what he was being asked to do. "They're my sister's kids," he whispered. "Were," William corrected coldly. "Your sister is dead, and these children are suffering. Sometimes mercy requires difficult choices." As Friday morning dawned, the final pieces of William's plan fell into place. The children were prepared for transport to what they believed was a revolutionary treatment center in Phoenix. Eleanor waved goodbye from the mansion steps, tears of hope streaming down her weathered cheeks, and in the desert, thunder let out a bellow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The medical transport van pulled away from the Ashford mansion at exactly 1:15 p.m. on Friday, carrying 5 passengers toward what 4 of them believed was hope. Eleanor stood on the marble steps waving until the vehicle disappeared beyond the estate gates, her heart lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since Robert's death, she allowed herself to believe that her grandchildren might actually survive. Inside the van, Patricia Hayes checked her clipboard for the 3rd time, her unease growing with each mile. The route Bobby Miller was taking made no sense for a trip to Phoenix. Instead of heading south toward Arizona, they were driving east into the heart of Nevada's most desolate region. When she questioned him, Bobby's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the black leather. "GPS says this is the fastest route," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes in the rearview mirror. Construction on the main highway. The children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the landscape change from suburban developments to barren scrubland. Emma held Noah's hand while Lucas pointed out rock formations to Sophie, trying to keep everyone's spirits up despite the growing heat inside the van. The air conditioning had mysteriously stopped working an hour into the journey, and the temperature gauge on the dashboard read 115 degrees Fahrenheit. "Uncle Bobby!" Emma called out, using the title Eleanor had taught them for any adult family friend. "How much longer until we get to the hospital?" Bobby's jaw clenched. These weren't just random children to him. They were his sister Sarah's babies, the nieces and nephews he'd watched being born before his addiction had driven him away from the family. Every giggle from the back seat felt like a knife twisting in his chest, but the $50,000 in his jacket pocket represented his only chance at staying alive. And his dealers had made it clear that failure to pay his debts would result in consequences far worse than death. Patricia noticed Bobby's increasingly erratic behavior and decided to take action. "Stop the van," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. "These children are showing signs of heat exhaustion. We need to get them hydrated and cooled down immediately." "Can't stop," Bobby replied, his voice barely audible. "Almost there." But they weren't almost there. Patricia could see nothing but endless desert stretching in every direction. No buildings, no road signs, no indication of civilization anywhere. The horrible truth began to crystallize in her mind as she watched the odometer tick past mile 45 from the mansion. At exactly 3:45 p.m., Bobby pulled the van to a stop at a crossroads that existed only in William Ashford's carefully planned coordinates. The location was perfect for his purposes, 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but hardpan and rock formations that would provide no shelter from the desert sun. A place where 4 sick children and their caregiver could disappear without a trace. "Everybody out," Bobby said, his voice cracking with emotion. Need to check the engine." Patricia grabbed his arm as he opened the driver's door. "Bobby, what's really happening here? Where are we?" The breakdown she'd been dreading finally came. Bobby's carefully constructed facade crumbled as he looked at the children climbing out of the van, their faces flushed with heat and confusion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "God help me. I'm so sorry." He reached under his seat and pulled out 2 bottles of water. Far too little for 5 people in desert conditions, but all that his conscience would allow him to leave. The children gathered around Patricia, sensing that something was terribly wrong, but not yet understanding the magnitude of their situation. "Uncle Bobby, why are you crying?" Sophie asked, her small hand reaching up to touch his face. The innocent gesture nearly broke him completely. Someone's coming for you," he managed to lie. "Just wait here. Don't wander off." Bobby climbed back into the van before any of them could respond, his hands shaking as he started the engine. Patricia pounded on the driver's side window, screaming for him to stop, but he couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at any of them. The van pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving 5 people stranded under the merciless Nevada sun. The silence that followed Bobby's departure was deafening. Patricia looked around desperately, searching for any sign of shelter or salvation, but found only the endless expanse of desert that stretched to every horizon. The temperature was climbing toward its daily peak of 118 degrees, and she knew from her medical training that they had perhaps 6 hours before dehydration became fatal. "Miss Patricia, where did Uncle Bobby go?" Noah asked, his 5-year-old mind unable to process the concept of abandonment. He had to get help," Patricia replied, forcing her voice to remain calm while her mind raced through their options. 2 bottles of water for 5 people. No shade, no shelter, no hope of rescue in a place where no one would think to look for them. Emma, displaying the premature wisdom that serious illness often brings to children, seemed to understand their situation better than her younger siblings. "We're not really going to a hospital, are we?" she asked quietly. Patricia knelt down to the 8-year-old's level, meeting her intelligent eyes. "I don't know what's happening, sweetheart, but I promise you this. I'm going to take care of you. All of you." The first hour passed slowly as Patricia rationed the water into tiny sips, using her medical knowledge to keep the children as cool as possible. She tore strips from her uniform to create makeshift sun hats and had them huddled together in the minimal shade cast by a large rock formation. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun reached its peak intensity, their situation became increasingly desperate. Lucas was the first to show serious signs of heat stroke. His asthma, combined with the extreme temperature, made every breath a struggle. Patricia watched helplessly as his lips began to crack, and his skin took on the dangerous flush that indicated his body's cooling system was failing. "I'm hot," Sophie whimpered, her fever from the ongoing pneumonia making her even more vulnerable to the heat. "I want Grandma Ellie." Noah had grown ominously quiet, his small body conserving energy in a way that terrified Patricia. As a pediatric nurse, she recognized the signs. His body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve vital organs. Without immediate intervention, the youngest member of their group would be the first to succumb. Miles away at Margaret's ranch, Thunder's behavior had escalated to something that defied explanation. The massive Brahman bull had somehow broken through 3 separate fence barriers, each one stronger than the last. Margaret found him at the eastern edge of her property, his huge head pointed toward the desert, with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Thunder, what's gotten into you?" she called out, approaching carefully. The bull she'd known as gentle and docile for 5 years had transformed into something primal and urgent. When she placed her hand on his flank, she could feel his entire body trembling with an energy that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. Margaret had rescued Thunder from an auction yard where he'd been scheduled for slaughter after his previous owner had given up on his behavioral problems. She'd never learned the full story of his past, but she'd seen enough traumatized animals to recognize the signs. Thunder had been carrying emotional scars long before she found him, wounds that ran deeper than any physical injury. But today was different. Today, Thunder's distress wasn't about past trauma. It was about something happening right now, something that demanded immediate action. The bull began walking east, not in his usual leisurely pace, but with the determined stride of an animal on a mission. Margaret made a decision that would later save 5 lives. "If you're going somewhere, big guy, I'm going with you." She ran back to the ranch house, grabbed her emergency medical kit and water supplies, and fired up her ATV. By the time she returned, Thunder was already a quarter-mile into the desert, following some invisible trail that only he could detect. The 40-mile journey that followed challenged everything Margaret thought she knew about animal behavior. Thunder moved through the trackless desert with the precision of a GPS unit, never hesitating, never taking a wrong turn. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, as if following a beacon that called to something deep in his genetic memory. Back at the abandonment site, the situation had become critical. Patricia had given the children the last of the water an hour ago, and Noah had slipped into unconsciousness. Emma lay curled next to her youngest brother, using her own body to shield him from the sun despite her own deteriorating condition. Lucas wheezed with each breath, his inhaler long since ineffective in the extreme heat. Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips moving in what Patricia realized were fragments of prayers Eleanor had taught her. "Hold on, babies," Patricia whispered, though she was no longer sure they could hear her. "Please, just hold on." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor, a speck appeared in the distance. At first, Patricia thought it was a mirage, her own dehydrated brain creating the image of salvation. But as the figure grew larger, she realized she was looking at the most beautiful sight of her life, a massive bull moving toward them with purpose and power, with a human figure on an ATV following close behind. Thunder had found them, guided by instincts that transcended human understanding, carrying hope across 40 miles of hell to reach 4 dying children who desperately needed a miracle. The race against time was about to begin. Thunder's massive hooves pounded against the hard-pan desert floor as he approached the abandoned group, his 1,200-pound frame moving with an urgency that defied his usual gentle nature. Patricia blinked hard, certain she was hallucinating from dehydration, but the enormous black Brahman bull with rust-colored patches was undeniably real. Behind him, the sound of an ATV engine cut through the desert silence like a prayer answered. Margaret Chen brought her four-wheeler to a skidding stop 20 yards away, dust swirling around her like a desert storm. She'd followed Thunder for nearly 3 hours across trackless wasteland, trusting in animal instincts she didn't understand but had learned never to question. What she found at the end of that impossible journey made her stomach clench with horror and rage. 4 children lay clustered together in the minimal shade of a rock formation, their small bodies showing every sign of severe heat exhaustion. The woman kneeling beside them, obviously a medical professional from her torn uniform, looked up with eyes that held both desperate hope and professional assessment of how close they'd all come to death. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed, grabbing her emergency medical kit and the gallon jugs of water she'd brought. "How long have you been out here?" "Since 3:45, Patricia managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The children, they're dehydrating fast. The little one, Noah, he's been unconscious for 30 minutes. Thunder approached the group with deliberate care, his massive head lowering to examine each child with the gentle precision Margaret had witnessed countless times with injured animals at her rescue ranch. When he reached Noah, the bull did something that would later be described in newspaper articles across the country as miraculous. He positioned his enormous body to cast maximum shade over the unconscious boy, then began breathing slowly and steadily, his exhaled air creating a cooling breeze across Noah's fevered face. Margaret worked with the efficiency of someone who'd handled animal emergencies for 20 years. She checked Noah's pulse, dangerously rapid and weak, then began administering small sips of electrolyte solution she'd mixed in the ATV ride. "What happened here? How did you end up 40 miles from nowhere?" Patricia's professional composure finally cracked as she explained Bobby's betrayal, William Ashford's deception, and the horror of watching 4 innocent children slowly dying in the desert heat. "He paid my nephew $50,000 to leave us here to die," she sobbed. These babies never hurt anybody. Emma's got cystic fibrosis. Lucas has severe asthma. Sophie's fighting pneumonia. And Noah, her voice broke completely. Noah's immune system is already compromised. Another hour and we would have lost him. Margaret's jaw tightened as she processed the magnitude of what she was hearing. Someone with unlimited resources had deliberately orchestrated the murder of 4 sick children, using family connections and financial desperation to ensure the job got done. The cold calculation required for such a plan made her physically ill. Emma stirred as Margaret helped her sip water, her 8-year-old eyes focusing with difficulty. "Are you an angel?" she whispered. "No, sweetheart," Margaret replied gently. "But that big guy over there might be." She nodded toward Thunder, who had somehow intuited that Lucas needed attention next. The bull moved carefully to position himself where his bulk would provide shade for the 7-year-old boy struggling with each breath. Thunder's behavior defied everything Margaret thought she knew about cattle psychology. Brahman bulls, especially ones his size, were typically territorial and unpredictable around strangers. Yet here he was, displaying an almost supernatural understanding of what these children needed, moving with the careful precision of a trained therapy animal. "How did you find us?" Patricia asked as Margaret worked to stabilize Sophie's condition. "Nobody knew where we were. That was the whole point." Margaret looked at Thunder, who was now gently nuzzling Noah's face with his massive nose, somehow knowing to be infinitely careful around the unconscious child. "I didn't find you," she said quietly. "He did. Thunder broke through 3 fences to get here, led me straight across 40 miles of desert like he had GPS coordinates burned into his brain." The revelation sent chills through Patricia, despite the desert heat. Animals didn't behave that way without reason. In her years of pediatric nursing, she'd seen therapy dogs that seemed to sense which children needed comfort most, but nothing approaching this level of purposeful intelligence. Loading 4 weakened children and an exhausted nurse onto an ATV designed for 2 people should have been impossible, but Thunder seemed to understand the logistical challenge. The massive bull positioned himself alongside the vehicle, allowing Margaret to use his broad back as a makeshift platform for the children who couldn't sit upright on the ATV. Emma, despite her weakened condition, showed remarkable courage as Margaret helped her climb onto Thunder's back. "He won't hurt us, will he?" she asked, her small hands gripping the bull's coarse hair. "He crossed 40 miles of desert to save you, honey," Margaret replied. "I don't think he's planning to hurt you now." The journey back to Margaret's ranch became a study in interspecies cooperation that would later be featured in veterinary journals. Thunder matched his pace exactly to the ATV's speed, never once stumbling or moving too quickly for his fragile passengers. When Lucas suffered an asthma attack halfway through the journey, Thunder actually stopped walking and turned his head back toward the boy, as if sensing the distress. Margaret used her inhaled bronchodilator from her emergency kit, a leftover from her own mild asthma, to help Lucas breathe, while Thunder stood perfectly still, providing a stable platform. The bull didn't resume walking until Lucas's breathing stabilized, and Margaret gave him what could only be described as an all-clear signal. Noah regained consciousness during the final mile of their journey, his 5-year-old mind processing the surreal experience of riding a giant bull across the Nevada desert. "Am I dreaming?" he asked weakly. "If you are, it's a good dream," Patricia assured him, tears streaming down her face as she realized all 4 children were going to survive. A very good dream. Margaret's ranch appeared on the horizon like an oasis, its modest buildings and green pastures offering the promise of safety and medical care. Thunder approached his home with visible relief, carefully lowering himself so his passengers could dismount safely before collapsing in the shade of the barn, utterly exhausted from his heroic journey. The next several hours passed in a blur of emergency medical care. Margaret's veterinary training, though officially revoked, proved invaluable in stabilizing the children's conditions. She set up IV drips to combat dehydration, used cooling blankets to bring down their core temperatures, and administered the emergency medications she kept on hand for animal rescues. Eleanor Thompson arrived at the ranch just after sunset, having received Margaret's phone call about finding her grandchildren abandoned in the desert. The sight of her 4 grandchildren alive and recovering, surrounded by the woman and bull who had saved them, brought the 73-year-old woman to her knees in grateful prayer. "I don't understand," Eleanor kept repeating as she held Noah's small hand. "Mr. Ashford said they were going to Phoenix for treatment. He seemed so kind, so generous." Patricia, now recovered enough to speak clearly, told Eleanor the full story of William Ashford's deception. "He planned this, Mrs. Thompson. Every detail. The fake medical facility, the transport to nowhere, even using your son Bobby to make sure there were no witnesses who could connect him to what happened." Eleanor's grief over Bobby's betrayal was almost as devastating as her relief over the children's survival. "My own boy," she whispered. "My Robert's brother sold these babies to that monster for money." Margaret watched Thunder through the barn window, the massive bull still keeping vigil over his new charges despite his own exhaustion. Something about this entire situation felt like more than coincidence, more than just fortunate timing. Thunder's behavior suggested a deeper connection, a purpose that transcended normal animal instincts. As the children slept safely in Margaret's guest rooms, their breathing steady and their fevers finally breaking, she made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Sheriff David Rodriguez, reporting the attempted murder of 4 children by Nevada's most powerful citizen. The second was to investigative reporter Janet Morrison at the Las Vegas Sun, ensuring that William Ashford's crime would receive the media attention it deserved. Thunder stood guard outside the house all night, his massive presence a comforting reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. The bull, who had somehow sensed 4 children's desperate need across 40 miles of desert, wasn't done with his mission yet. The hardest part, seeking justice, was still to come. Sheriff David Rodriguez arrived at Margaret's ranch at dawn with 3 deputies and a growing sense that this case would define his 20-year career in law enforcement. The preliminary report Patricia Hayes had given over the phone sounded like something from a crime novel. Nevada's most prominent citizen allegedly orchestrating the murder of 4 sick children. But seeing the evidence firsthand, Rodriguez knew they were dealing with a monster hiding behind a philanthropist's mask. The children were awake but fragile, huddled together in Margaret's living room with Thunder standing guard outside the window like a furry sentinel. Rodriguez had investigated child abuse cases before, but nothing had prepared him for the calculated cruelty of what William Ashford had planned. The 40-mile distance from the drop-off point to the nearest town wasn't accidental. It was precisely calculated to ensure no rescue would be possible. "Mrs. Hayes," Rodriguez said gently to Patricia, "I need you to walk me through everything that happened, from the moment you were hired to the moment you were found." Patricia's testimony painted a picture of systematic deception that chilled everyone in the room. The fake medical facility, the deliberately broken air conditioning, the careful selection of Bobby Miller as the driver. Every detail showed premeditation of the most heinous kind. When she described William's cold demeanor around the children, Eleanor Thompson made a sound like a wounded animal. "He fooled me completely," Eleanor whispered, her arthritic hands trembling. "I thought he was saving them. I practically handed my grandbabies to a killer." Rodriguez had already dispatched units to arrest Bobby Miller, but what they found at his apartment made the case even more tragic. Bobby had overdosed on heroin within hours of abandoning the children, leaving behind a rambling suicide note that confessed everything. The note revealed details that would break Eleanor's heart all over again. Bobby had recognized his sister's children in the van, but had been too desperate and drug-sick to save them. "I can't live with what I done to Sarah's babies," the note read. "Uncle Bobby was supposed to protect them, not kill them. That rich man, he knew they was family. He wanted it to hurt more. God forgive me, I was too weak to say no." While Rodriguez processed the crime scene evidence, William Ashford was beginning his Friday morning routine at his mansion, completely unaware that his victims had been rescued. He'd planned to wait 72 hours before reporting the children missing during transport, giving the desert enough time to erase all evidence. In his mind, the children were already dead, and by Sunday evening he'd be accepting condolences as the grieving benefactor who'd tried so hard to save them. The first indication that his plan had failed came when his head of security burst into his study without knocking, a breach of protocol that would normally result in immediate termination. "Sir, there are police cars coming up the driveway," the security chief announced. "At least 6 units plus what looks like federal vehicles." William's blood turned to ice. There was no way the children could have survived 40 miles in the desert without water or shelter. Even if someone had found them, they should have been too dehydrated to tell coherent stories. His plan had been perfect, foolproof, designed by someone who'd spent years calculating every possible variable. Sheriff Rodriguez led the arrest team personally, taking grim satisfaction in reading William Ashford his rights in the same marble foyer where Eleanor Thompson had begged for help just days earlier. The handcuffs looked oddly appropriate on wrists that had signed billion-dollar deals and charity donations with equal cold calculation. "William Ashford, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Emma Thompson, Lucas Thompson, Sophie Thompson, and Noah Thompson," Rodriguez announced, his voice echoing through the mansion's vaulted ceilings. "You have the right to remain silent." William's carefully constructed public persona cracked as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his lawyer's training kicking in. "Those children were in my care. I was trying to help them." "By abandoning them in the desert to die?" Rodriguez replied coldly. "We have witnesses, Mr. Ashford. We have your driver's suicide confession. We have evidence of premeditation going back days." The arrest of Nevada's most powerful citizen sent shockwaves through Las Vegas society and beyond. By noon, news vans lined the street outside the Ashford mansion, and by evening the story had gone national. The images were stark and compelling. A billionaire in handcuffs, 4 sick children who'd survived against impossible odds, and the massive bull who'd somehow led their rescue across 40 miles of desert. But William's wealth and connections weren't going to fade quietly. Within hours of his arrest, a team of high-powered defense attorneys descended on Las Vegas like vultures, immediately launching a media campaign to discredit the prosecution's case. They painted William as a grieving father, whose judgment had been clouded by the loss of his son, suggesting that the children's abandonment was the result of Bobby Miller's drug-addled decisions rather than any deliberate plan. "Our client is the victim here," lead defense attorney Marcus Sterling announced at a hastily called press conference. He opened his heart and his home to these children, only to have his trust betrayed by an addict who took advantage of his generosity. The defense strategy was as calculated as William's original crime: paint him as a victim of circumstances, minimize his direct involvement, and hope that his charitable reputation would create reasonable doubt. They had investigators dig into Patricia Hayes's background, looking for anything that might discredit her testimony. They questioned Margaret Chen's mental health, suggesting that her communication with Thunder was evidence of psychological instability. Eleanor Thompson found herself under attack from private investigators and hostile media coverage that questioned everything from her fitness as a guardian to her family's history of addiction. The woman who'd barely survived raising 4 sick children on Social Security was now being portrayed as an opportunist seeking to profit from tragedy. "They're trying to make us the criminals," Eleanor told Margaret one evening, as they sat on the ranch porch, watching Thunder graze peacefully with the children playing nearby. "All that money, all those lawyers, and they're making it sound like we asked for this to happen." Margaret had her own battles to fight. The Nevada State Veterinary Board was threatening to file charges against her for practicing without a license, despite the fact that her actions had saved 4 lives. Animal Control was questioning her fitness to run a rescue ranch, suggesting that Thunder's behavior indicated improper training or potential danger to the public. "The system protects people like William Ashford," Margaret said bitterly. "He has enough money to buy justice, to rewrite the narrative until black becomes white." The children, despite their young ages, seemed to understand that the adult world was failing them again. Emma, at 8 years old, displayed a wisdom that broke Margaret's heart when she asked, "Why are the grown-ups trying to help the bad man?" Lucas, 7, had become protective of Thunder, spending hours in the barn telling the massive bull stories and sharing his fears. "Thunder saved us," he told anyone who would listen. "He's the goodest boy in the whole world." Sophie and Noah, the youngest, struggled with nightmares and separation anxiety, clinging to Eleanor and Margaret with desperate intensity. The trauma of abandonment had wounded them in ways that would take years to heal, and now the legal system was forcing them to relive their terror in depositions and interviews. As the preliminary hearings began, it became clear that William Ashford's defense team was prepared to wage a war of attrition, using their client's vast resources to overwhelm the prosecution and exhaust the victim's resolve. They filed motion after motion, seeking to exclude evidence, discredit witnesses, and delay proceedings until public attention moved on to other stories. Thunder seemed to sense the renewed threat to his adopted family. The massive bull had taken to standing between the children and any strangers who approached the ranch, his dark eyes holding an intelligence that made hardened investigators uncomfortable. When Child Services arrived to evaluate the children's living situation, Thunder positioned himself directly in their path, forcing them to approach with respect rather than bureaucratic authority. The battle for justice was just beginning, and it would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. But in the growing darkness of legal manipulation and media spin, one truth remained constant. Thunder had crossed 40 miles of hell to save 4 innocent lives, and he wasn't about to let anyone take them away again. The courthouse steps buzzed with media attention as the preliminary hearing for People vs. William Ashford began its second week. Outside, Thunder stood in the bed of Margaret's pickup truck, his massive presence drawing crowds of supporters who'd driven from across Nevada to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. The bull had become an unlikely symbol of justice, his story capturing hearts nationwide and putting pressure on the legal system to deliver accountability. Inside the courtroom, defense attorney Marcus Sterling was systematically dismantling the prosecution's case with the surgical precision that $2,000 per hour legal fees could buy. He'd already succeeded in having Bobby Miller's suicide confession ruled inadmissible, arguing that the testimony of a dead heroin addict couldn't be cross-examined. Patricia Hayes's credibility had been attacked from every angle. Her recent divorce, her financial desperation, even her decision to accept William's job in the first place. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sterling announced during his opening statement, "we're not here to try my client for being wealthy. We're not here because some people believe that success must come with guilt. William Ashford is a grieving father who made a mistake in trusting the wrong person with precious cargo. 4 sick children who deserve better than what Bobby Miller gave them." District Attorney Rebecca Martinez knew she was fighting an uphill battle against Nevada's most expensive legal team, but she had something Sterling couldn't buy: the truth, and 4 brave children who'd lived through hell. When she called Eleanor Thompson to the witness stand, the 73-year-old woman's dignity and pain cut through the courtroom's expensive suits and legal maneuvering like a sword. "Mrs. Thompson," Martinez asked gently, Can you tell the jury about your meeting with Mr. Ashford? Eleanor's voice shook as she recounted that desperate morning when she'd begged for help. He looked at those pictures of my grandchildren for the longest time. I thought he was studying their medical conditions, trying to figure out how to help. Now I know he was planning how to hurt them. Sterling's cross-examination was brutal in its politeness. Mrs. Thompson, isn't it true that your own son Bobby had a history of drug abuse and theft? Isn't it possible that Mr. Ashford was as much a victim of Bobby's deception as you were? My Bobby was sick, Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her weathered face. But he was still my son, and those children were still his family. Mr. Ashford knew exactly who Bobby was when he hired him. He counted on Bobby being too desperate to say no. The courtroom's turning point came when 8-year-old Emma Thompson took the witness stand. Judge Harrison had initially resisted allowing such young witnesses, but Emma's maturity and clear memory of events made her testimony crucial. Wearing her best dress, a hand-me-down Eleanor had carefully mended, Emma faced the courtroom with the same courage she'd shown in the desert. "Emma," D.A. Martinez asked softly, "can you tell us what Mr. Ashford said when he visited you at his house?" Emma's voice was clear and strong despite her small size. "He asked us about our parents. When I told him Mama and Daddy died in an accident, he got real quiet. Then he asked how old we were, and when I said I was 8, like his son Michael used to be, he looked angry, like we'd done something wrong by being the same age." Sterling objected repeatedly during Emma's testimony, but the damage was done. The child's innocent observation had revealed William's psychological trigger in a way that no adult witness could have conveyed. When Margaret Chen took the stand, she brought with her veterinary records, GPS data from her ATV, and photographs that told the story of Thunder's impossible journey across the desert. But Sterling was ready for her too, questioning her mental stability and suggesting that her mystical connection with Thunder indicated psychological problems. "Miss Chen, you lost your veterinary license due to what medical records describe as a psychological break. Is that correct?" "I suffered from PTSD after my fiancé died in a car accident," Margaret replied steadily. "But that doesn't change the fact that Thunder somehow knew 4 children were dying 40 miles away and led me directly to them. Or perhaps you followed news reports and staged this dramatic rescue for personal attention?" The suggestion hung in the air like poison until D.A. Martinez stood for redirect examination. "Miss Chen, had there been any news reports about missing children on the day you followed Thunder into the desert?" "No," Margaret replied firmly. "No one even knew they were missing yet. Mr. Ashford wasn't planning to report them gone for another 2 days, remember?" The prosecution's case seemed to be building momentum until Sterling played his masterstroke. He introduced evidence that Margaret Chen had been engaged to Michael Ashford 8 years earlier, a detail that had somehow escaped the initial investigation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom and provided the defense with a motive to discredit Margaret's entire rescue story. "Isn't it true, Miss Chen, that you blame my client for your fiancé's death?" Sterling asked with theatrical concern. "Isn't it possible that your rescue of these children was actually an elaborate revenge plot designed to destroy an innocent man?" Margaret's face went white as the implications sank in. "Michael died because I asked him to pick me up from the airport during a storm. William wasn't even, but you've harbored resentment against the Ashford family ever since, haven't you? In fact, you purchased Thunder from an auction specifically because he had belonged to Michael, didn't you?" The courtroom erupted as Margaret struggled to explain a connection she'd kept secret even from herself. Yes, she'd bought Thunder from an auction. Yes, she'd later discovered he'd belonged to Michael. But she'd never connected those facts to William's identity or planned any kind of revenge. "I loved Michael," she whispered. I would never use his death to hurt innocent children. But Sterling had planted enough doubt to muddy the waters. The prosecution's star witness was now portrayed as a mentally unstable woman with a personal vendetta, and her miraculous rescue story seemed suspiciously convenient. William Ashford finally took the stand in his own defense on a Thursday afternoon, dressed in a simple gray suit that his image consultants had selected to project humility. His testimony was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, painting himself as a grieving father whose judgment had been clouded by loss. "I see Michael in every child," he said, his voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "When Mrs. Thompson showed me those photographs, all I could think about was giving those babies the chance that my son never got. I trusted Bobby Miller because he was family. I never imagined he would betray that trust so completely." D.A. Martinez's cross-examination revealed the calculated nature of William's deception, but he had answers for everything. The fake medical facility was a temporary setup to provide immediate care. The desert route was Bobby's decision. The lack of proper medical supplies was an oversight, not intentional sabotage. "Mr. Ashford," Martinez pressed, "why did you wait 3 days to report the children missing if you truly believed they were receiving medical care in Phoenix?" "I was told the treatment required privacy and couldn't be interrupted," William replied smoothly. "I was respecting what I believed were medical protocols." The testimony that changed everything came from an unexpected source: Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency room physician who'd treated the children after their rescue. The prosecution had called her to testify about the severity of the children's condition, but during Sterling's cross-examination, she revealed something that would expose William's true nature. "Dr. Martinez, in your medical opinion, how long could these children have survived in desert conditions without proper hydration? Based on their condition when they arrived, I'd estimate they had perhaps 2 hours left before organ failure became irreversible. So if someone had intended them to die, the timing would have had to be very precise." Dr. Martinez paused, realizing where the question was leading. Yes, someone would have needed detailed knowledge of desert survival rates, dehydration progression, and the specific medical vulnerabilities of each child. The implication was devastating. William's plan hadn't been the impulsive decision of a grief-stricken man. It had been calculated with medical precision to ensure the children would die slowly enough to eliminate suspicion, but quickly enough to prevent rescue. As the trial entered its final phase, public opinion began to shift decisively against William Ashford. Thunder's daily presence outside the courthouse had become a rallying point for supporters who saw the case as a symbol of ordinary people fighting against corrupt power. The Bull's story had gone viral on social media, with #ThundersJustice trending nationally. Eleanor Thompson stood on the courthouse steps after Dr. Martinez's testimony, her small frame somehow towering over the crowd of reporters. "That man calculated how long it would take my grandbabies to die," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza. "He didn't just want them dead. He wanted them to suffer first. What kind of monster does that to innocent children?" Inside the courthouse, William Ashford sat with his legal team, finally understanding that his carefully constructed defense was crumbling. The wealthy philanthropist who'd believed he could buy his way out of any consequence was about to discover that some crimes were too heinous for even unlimited resources to excuse. The jury would begin deliberations the next morning, but everyone in that courtroom knew the verdict had already been written in the hearts of 4 children who'd survived hell and the courage of those who'd refused to let their story be buried. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before reaching their verdict, a remarkably short time for such a complex case. When the foreman stood to announce their decision, the packed courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Thunder's hooves on the pavement outside, where the massive bull paced restlessly as if sensing the moment of truth had arrived. We, the jury, find the defendant, William Ashford, guilty on all counts of attempted murder in the first degree. Eleanor Thompson collapsed into Margaret Chen's arms, 8 months of anguish finally releasing in great heaving sobs. The four children, who'd been watching from the gallery under the protection of victim advocates, seemed too young to fully comprehend that justice had finally been served. But Emma's mature eyes reflected a relief that went beyond her 8 years. William Ashford showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his lawyer's training keeping his face carefully neutral even as his billion-dollar empire crumbled around him. But those who knew him well noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the way his shoulders seemed to cave inward, as if the weight of his crimes was finally crushing his carefully constructed facade. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following Friday, giving the defense time to prepare mitigation arguments while allowing the prosecution to compile victim impact statements. The week between verdict and sentencing became a media circus, with Thunder's story capturing international attention and turning the Nevada bull into an unlikely symbol of hope and justice. Margaret's ranch was flooded with visitors, donations, and offers from Hollywood producers wanting to buy the movie rights to Thunder's heroic journey. Children from across the country sent drawings and letters to the hero bull, while animal behaviorists debated the science behind Thunder's seemingly impossible navigation across 40 miles of trackless desert. Dr. Temple Grandin herself flew to Nevada to study Thunder's behavior, spending hours observing the gentle giant who'd become famous for his empathy and protective instincts. What this bull did defies current understanding of bovine behavior, she told reporters. The precision of his navigation, the purposefulness of his actions, the way he positioned himself to protect the children, it suggests cognitive abilities we're only beginning to recognize in cattle. But for Margaret and Eleanor, the media attention was secondary to the healing process that was finally beginning for the four children. Emma had started sleeping through the night without nightmares. Lucas was playing with Thunder in the pasture, his laughter echoing across the desert landscape. Sophie had gained weight and her pneumonia was finally clearing up completely. Little Noah, who'd come closest to death in that desert hell, now followed Thunder everywhere, the massive bull serving as both protector and playmate. The night before sentencing, Margaret found Eleanor sitting on the ranch porch, staring out at the desert that had almost claimed her grandchildren's lives. Thunder grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture, the children's voices carrying on the evening breeze as they played a game of tag around his massive legs. "I keep thinking about Bobby," Eleanor said quietly. "My own son, helping that monster hurt these babies. I raised him better than that, Margaret. I know I did." Margaret sat beside the older woman, both of them drawing comfort from Thunder's gentle presence. Addiction changes people in ways we can't always understand. Bobby was sick, Eleanor. In the end, he knew what he'd done was wrong. That's why he couldn't live with it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm a terrible person for not forgiving him, Eleanor continued. The good book says we're supposed to forgive, but when I think about those children dying in that desert because of choices he made, her voice trailed off into the gathering darkness. Forgiveness isn't the same as excusing, Margaret replied. You can forgive Bobby for being sick while still holding him accountable for his choices, just like we can acknowledge William's grief over losing Michael while still demanding justice for what he did to Emma, Lucas, Sophie, and Noah. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the trial, with Thunder once again standing vigil outside the courthouse. This time, Sheriff Rodriguez had arranged for the bull to be positioned where the children could see him through the courtroom windows, providing them with visible comfort during what would be an emotional day. Rebecca Martinez presented victim impact statements that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. Eleanor Thompson spoke about the terror of watching her grandchildren fight for life, the guilt of trusting their killer, and the long road to healing that still lay ahead. Margaret described the moment she'd found 4 children abandoned to die, and how their rescue had given new purpose to both her life and Thunder's. But it was Emma Thompson's statement that brought the courtroom to complete silence. Standing at the podium with a maturity that belied her 8 years, she spoke directly to William Ashford with a clarity that cut through all legal maneuvering. "Mr. Ashford, I don't understand why you wanted to hurt us. We never did anything to you or your son. Grandma Ellie says your boy Michael died, and that made you very sad, but trying to kill us wouldn't bring him back. It would just make more people sad like you are." Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Thunder saved us because he has a good heart. He didn't care that we were sick or poor or different from him. He just knew we needed help, and he came to find us. I think that's what people are supposed to do, help each other instead of hurting each other." The 8-year-old looked directly at William for the first time. "I hope someday you can have a good heart like Thunder does. I hope you can stop being so sad that you want other people to be sad too." William Ashford's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he listened to forgiveness from a child he'd tried to murder, her words carrying more power than any legal argument his expensive attorneys could have crafted. Judge Harrison imposed the maximum sentence allowed by law, 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, plus additional charges for child endangerment, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse in Bobby Miller's death. The sentence ensured that William Ashford would die in prison, his billions unable to buy him even one more day of freedom. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Harrison said before pronouncing sentence, "your crimes represent a level of premeditated cruelty that shocks the conscience. You used your wealth and position to exploit the desperation of a grieving family, turning their hope into a weapon against innocent children. The fact that these children survived is not due to any mercy on your part, but to the heroic actions of individuals who possess the very humanity you abandoned." As bailiffs led William away in shackles, he turned for one last look at the children he'd tried to kill. Emma met his gaze with the same steady courage she'd shown throughout the trial, her small hand raised in what might have been a wave goodbye or a gesture of final forgiveness. 6 months after sentencing, Margaret's ranch had been transformed into something beautiful and healing. The Thunder Foundation had been established with donations from around the world, creating a therapeutic center where traumatized children could find healing through interaction with rescue animals. Thunder himself had been certified as a therapy animal, his gentle presence helping dozens of children process their own traumas. Eleanor Thompson had moved permanently to the ranch, becoming the Foundation's Director of Family Services and finding new purpose in helping other families navigate crisis and recovery. The 4 children were thriving in ways that seemed miraculous after their brush with death. Emma's lung function had improved dramatically, Lucas's asthma was well controlled, Sophie showed no lingering effects from her pneumonia, and Noah had grown stronger and more confident every day. On a crisp December evening, exactly 1 year after that terrible day in the desert, the family gathered around Thunder's pasture for their weekly tradition of sharing gratitude. The massive bull stood peacefully among them, his dark eyes reflecting the warmth of the setting sun and the contentment that comes from a life lived with purpose. "What are you thankful for this week, Emma?" Eleanor asked, continuing their ritual. "I'm thankful that Thunder knew we needed him," Emma replied, her hand resting on the bull's flank. "And I'm thankful that bad things can sometimes lead to good things, like how meeting Margaret gave us a new home and how Thunder's story helps other kids who are scared." Margaret watched the scene with wonder, still amazed by the journey that had brought them all together. A year ago, she'd been a broken woman living in isolation with a traumatized bull, both of them carrying wounds from the past. Now, they were part of a family, bound not by blood but by love, survival, and the understanding that healing is always possible when hearts remain open to hope. Thunder lifted his massive head toward the stars beginning to appear in the desert sky, and for a moment Margaret could swear she saw something eternal and peaceful in his gentle eyes. The bull who had crossed 40 miles of hell to save 4 innocent lives had found his own salvation in the process, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes carry the biggest hearts. The desert wind whispered across the ranch, carrying with it the laughter of children, the contentment of animals, and the quiet satisfaction that comes when justice prevails and love conquers even the darkest evil. My dear friends, as we reach the golden years of our lives, we often wonder if our stories still matter, if we can still make a difference when the world seems to have moved on without us. Eleanor Thompson was 73 when she faced the unthinkable, watching her 4 precious grandchildren slip away from diseases she couldn't afford to treat. Like so many of us, she'd already buried a husband and a son, carrying grief that threatened to crush her spirit. But in her darkest hour, when the system failed and evil wore a philanthropist's mask, salvation came from the most unexpected source, a gentle bull named Thunder, who proved that love transcends all boundaries. Eleanor's courage to fight for justice, even when billionaire lawyers tried to silence her, reminds us that our voices still carry power. Her journey from desperate grandmother to foundation director shows us that it's never too late for new beginnings, that sometimes our greatest purpose emerges from our deepest pain. Whether you're caring for grandchildren, fighting health battles, or feeling forgotten by a world that values youth over wisdom, remember, you are Eleanor. Your story matters. Your love can still move mountains. Share with us. What moment in your life taught you that love is stronger than any obstacle? Have you ever found unexpected hope in your darkest hour?